You're watching Jasmine Lovetale's original story. They had already tightened the leather straps when she started shaking. Eleanor Appleton didn't fight. She had seen other Omegas go through the rite of containment in the training yard of Blackthorn Citadel. She knew the rule. Endure it quietly. Do not embarrass the pack. But when the pressure became unbearable, her control broke. "It hurts," she sobbed, her voice cracking across the stone yard. "I can't close my legs." The words were not loud, but they carried. Nobles standing beneath the carved banners looked away. The elder council remained seated. A few guards shifted their weight and stared at the ground as if the cobblestones had suddenly become interesting. Alpha King Henry Luxford stood at the edge of the ritual circle, arms folded behind his back. He had approved this rite years ago. He had watched it enforced without hesitation. But now he was watching her. Her fingers clawed at the stone. Her breath came in short, uneven pulls. This was not discipline. This was damaged. And when the Alpha King stepped forward, the entire pack felt something shift. "Hey, lovely. Pause for just a second. How are you feeling right now? If that moment hit you in the chest the way it was meant to, thank you for being here. It truly means more than you know. I am building something special on this channel, and I am working toward 10,000 subscribers. If this story is already pulling you in, please subscribe to Jasmine Lovetales, press like, and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Your support keeps these stories alive. Now, let us go back to the moment the king chose to break a law older than his crown. Chapter 1. The rite of containment had existed in Blackthorn Citadel for longer than any living elder could honestly remember. It was older than the stone walls of the citadel itself, and older than the Luxford bloodline that ruled the Northern Territory. The elders said it was necessary. The pack had never questioned it loudly enough to matter. The training yard where the rite was carried out sat at the center of the citadel's lower quarter. It was a wide, open space of dark cobblestone, bordered by iron torch rings on iron posts, surrounded by upper galleries where pack members sometimes stood to watch drills and assessments. It was not designed for spectacle, but it had become one. Eleanor Appleton had been brought there an hour before midday. She was 19 years old, 5 feet and 4 inches of muscle and weariness, with dark red hair that she kept tied back, and grey eyes that had learned, over years of service in the citadel kitchens, to stay pointed at the floor. She worked 6 days out of 7. She earned 1 silver coin per month. Heat suppressants cost 4 silver coins per cycle. She had been 2 weeks short when her body decided it would not wait. The heat had come without warning during the morning bread preparation. One moment she was measuring flour. Next, her skin felt like the inside of a furnace. Her scent changed before she could manage it, warm and sharp in a way that made every wolf in the kitchen turn toward her at once. Shannon Swales, who worked the oven beside her and had been in service at Blackthorn longer than anyone, had grabbed Eleanor's arm immediately and whispered to keep still. It had not helped. Taylor Torp, the pack enforcer assigned to the lower citadel, had arrived within minutes. He was a broad man with small eyes and the kind of expression that never changed regardless of what he was looking at. He had not asked Eleanor any questions. He had recited the statute. Unsanctioned heat without documented suppressant usage was a Class 2 violation under Omega containment law. What the penalty was public right. Eleanor had not fought him. There was no point. Fighting an enforcer in public only added charges, and she had heard what happened to the Omegas who added charges. The restraint apparatus in the training yard was a wooden frame built low to the ground, fitted with leather straps that were intended, according to the law's formal language, to prevent involuntary movement during the correction process. Or the correction process involved controlled pressure applied to specific points of the body to suppress the heat cycle. The older texts described it as medicinal. The women who had been through it described it differently, in whispers, in the dark, to each other. Eleanor was restrained at the wrists and upper thighs. The leather was thick and old. The buckles were iron. The frame held her in a position that was not painful at the start. But the enforcer, Taylor Torp, had noted in his report that morning that the council had amended the lawful duration of the rite the previous winter, extending it from 30 minutes to 55. He had applied the new standard without informing anyone outside his chain of command. By the 40-minute mark, Eleanor Appleton's thighs were shaking from the strain of the restraint angle. The pressure across her hips had moved from discomfort into something that made her vision blur. She pressed her lips together. She tried to breathe through it. She thought about the northern villages where her mother had once told her that omegas lived without packs at all, and she held on to that image and tried not to make a sound. She made a sound. It started as a low, involuntary pull of air. Then the buckle at her left thigh bit deeper into muscle, and her control fractured like a dry branch. "It hurts," she said, and her voice was raw and unguarded in a way she hated. "I can't close my legs." The training yard was quiet, except for the sound of torch fire and wind cutting across the upper battlements. Shannon Swales, who had followed at a distance and now stood near the far gallery wall with her arms wrapped around herself, pressed the back of her hand against her mouth. The elder council members, seated on the platform to Eleanor's left, didn't move. Brandon Garside, the oldest among them, kept both hands folded on his walking stick and kept his gaze deliberately forward. Henry Luxford moved. He had been standing at the edge of the ritual circle with his captain of the guard, Liam Clifton, going over patrol reassignments for the outer wall. He had been aware of the rite happening, the same way he was aware of all enforcement actions in the Citadel, as an administrative fact, while he had signed the original Rite of Containment expansion order 5 years ago after a run of unrest in the lower quarters. The elders had told him it would stabilize pack behavior. He had believed them because he was 27 years old and still learning what belief could cost. He was 32 now. He had learned considerably more. He crossed the cobblestones in 8 steps. He held up one hand. Taylor Torp, who had been adjusting the left strap, stopped immediately. "Just release her," Henry said. Torp did not move right away. He was not being defiant. He was genuinely uncertain because no Alpha King had ever stopped a sacred rite mid-process. The law was explicit. Once the rite was initiated, it ran to completion. Those were the older texts. Those were the words. Henry's voice had not been loud, but it had been absolute, and Torp began unfastening the straps. Connor Rowley was on his feet before the second buckle was undone. Connor Rowley was the head of the Elder Council, 61 years old. With a white beard he kept trimmed short and eyes the colour of old iron. He had served 3 Luxford kings. He had no patience for what he was currently seeing. "Your Majesty," Connor said, and his voice carried the particular flatness of a man choosing his words with great care. "The Rite of Containment is in lawful progress. Interrupting it sets a precedent this council cannot absorb, or I would ask you to reconsider publicly." Henry did not look at Connor. He was watching Eleanor, who had not yet been fully released. Her hands were free. The straps at her thighs were still being worked loose. Her head was down, and her hair had come out of its tie and hung around her face in tangled pieces. "Noted," Henry said to Connor. He did not say anything else. He crouched down beside the wooden frame. Liam Clifton, who had followed him across the yard without being asked, came to stand slightly behind and to the left, hand on his sword hilt out of habit. Eleanor finally looked up. Her grey eyes were wet, but her jaw was set. She was not embarrassed the way Henry had expected. She was angry. The anger was quiet and controlled, and very old, the kind that does not get made by a single morning, but by years of mornings stacked on top of each other. Henry looked at her, and then looked at the red marks already visible across the tops of her thighs, where the straps had compressed muscle and skin for 40 minutes. He looked at those marks the way a man looks at something he cannot undo. "Can you stand?" he asked. She did not answer immediately. She pushed herself upright, using the edge of the frame and her own arms, refusing the help that Torp reflexively moved to offer. Her legs held. Barely. But they held. "She needs the healer's wing," Henry said to Liam. Then, loudly enough for the gallery and the platform to hear, "The Rite is suspended, today and until further review." The sound that moved through the training yard was not a gasp. It was something more complicated. It was the sound of 200 people realizing simultaneously that the ground they were standing on had just shifted, and none of them were sure yet in which direction. Connor Rowley sat back down slowly. His face gave away nothing except the slight tension at the corners of his mouth, the only sign that something inside him had just gone very cold. Chapter 2. The Medical Truth. The healer's wing of Blackthorn Citadel was located in the east corridor of the second level, 3 floors above the training yard. It smelled of dried herbs and beeswax, and something faintly metallic that never fully went away, regardless of how often the stone was cleaned. There were 12 patient beds arranged along 2 stone walls, each separated by a curtain of heavy linen. On a normal day, the wing served soldiers with training injuries and kitchen staff with burns and the occasional elderly noble who had overestimated their constitution at the feast table. Amelie Hampton ran the wing the way a quartermaster runs a supply depot, efficiently, without sentiment, and with complete intolerance for people who wasted her time. She was 43 years old, trained in 3 separate healer traditions, and the only person in Blackthorn Citadel who could speak to Henry Luxford in something approaching plain language without being dismissed. She had earned that position over 15 years of keeping his soldiers alive when military surgeons had already given up. She examined Eleanor Appleton without waiting for instructions from anyone. Liam Clifton had escorted Eleanor to the wing door, told Amelie only that the king had ordered her seen immediately, and then stepped back into the corridor. Amelie had taken one look at Eleanor's posture and the way she was favoring her left side and told her to sit on the nearest bed. Eleanor sat. She kept her hands in her lap and her eyes on the wall across from her. When Amelie pressed careful fingers along the top of her left thigh, Eleanor breathed in sharply but did not make another sound. "Tell me where it's sharp and where it's dull," Amelie said. "Sharp at the top of the left leg, or dull everywhere below the hip," Eleanor said. Her voice was flat, not unfriendly. Simply a person describing damage the way you describe damage when you have described damage many times before. Amelie continued working. She noted bruising beginning to form at both upper thighs, worse on the left. She noted pressure irritation at both wrists from the hand restraints. She noted that the muscle along the inside of Eleanor's left hip had been strained in a way consistent with the frame being held at an angle for significantly longer than the old standard of 30 minutes allowed. She set down her instruments and wrote in her record book. She wrote slowly and precisely, because she understood that this record might matter later. Henry arrived 20 minutes after Eleanor. He came alone, without Liam or any attendant, which was itself unusual enough that Amelie registered it without commenting. He stopped in the doorway of the curtained space. Eleanor saw him and turned her face away. Not in fear, in refusal. Amelie spoke before Henry could. The restraint duration exceeded the lawful maximum by at least 25 minutes, based on what I'm seeing in this tissue, she said. The old statute set a 30-minute maximum. She shows damage consistent with 50 minutes or more. Henry was quiet for a moment. The statute was 30 minutes, It was. Amelie set her record book on the side table. The Elder Council amended it last winter. The new standard is 55 minutes. The amendment came through the Council's internal legislative record, not through a royal decree. It carries your seal because it was bundled into a broader administrative package that your office approved in bulk during the border negotiations with the Eastern Territory. Henry's expression didn't change, but his right hand, resting at his side, closed slowly into a fist and then opened again. Who approved the bundling? That is a question for your treasurer and your scribe, Amelie said. My question is simpler. What do you want me to do for this patient? Henry looked at Eleanor. She had not turned back toward him. She was staring at a point on the stone wall where the mortar had cracked and been patched with something slightly lighter in color. Her jaw was tight. Her hands were still in her lap, very still, the way hands get when their owner is working hard to keep them that way. Treat her fully, Henry said. Whatever she needs. She stays here until Amelie clears her. No enforcer access to this wing until I say otherwise. Eleanor's head turned slightly at the last sentence, not toward him. Just enough that the angle of her face changed. She had heard it. She did not thank him. She went back to looking at the patched stone. Sir Henry left the healer's wing and stood in the east corridor for a long moment. The corridor was empty. Torchlight moved in the draught, coming through the arrow slits in the outer wall. He had signed something he had not read carefully enough, and someone had used that signature to make a sacred rite significantly more damaging than he had authorized. He did not know yet whether that was negligence or design. He had a strong suspicion it was designed. He stood in that corridor and thought about the 5 years since he had approved the rite's expansion. He had been a young king, 2 years into his reign, managing 3 border disputes simultaneously. While the Elder Council handled interior governance, he had not yet learned to watch closely. Connor Rowley had presented the expansion as a standard administrative update, a minor adjustment to an existing framework. The document had been dense and formal, sitting between 37 other items on a busy morning. Henry had signed the stack without examining it, the way he should have. He thought about whether he had asked, even once in 5 years, how the rite was being applied, whether the 30-minute standard he believed was in place still actually governed enforcement in the training yard, whether anyone had been harmed in ways that went past discomfort into real damage. He had no memory of asking. He had received no reports that prompted concern. The citadel had been stable. He had assumed that quiet meant acceptable, and he was only now beginning to understand that quiet and acceptable were not the same thing, and that the distinction between them was precisely what the people who built the system had been counting on. He went to find Dexter Pickering. Chapter 3. The Money Trail. Dexter Pickering had served as Royal Treasurer of the Luxford Dominion for 11 years. He was 50 years old, thin in the way that men become thin when they spend their working hours at a desk and their meals as interruptions to paperwork rather than as events in themselves. He had an extraordinary memory for numbers and a deep discomfort with confrontation, which made him very good at his job and very poor at delivering news he expected his audience to dislike. He was already organizing ledgers when Henry arrived in the Treasury chamber, because Liam Clifton had sent word ahead that the king was coming and wanted the Omega wage records and the apothecary licensing files. Dexter had those files out. He also had a glass of water for himself that he was not drinking. The Treasury chamber was a long room below the great hall, lined with iron-banded chests and shelves of bound ledgers going back 4 reigns. It smelled of dust and metal and old wax from the seal press on the central table. 2 candles burned near Dexter's station because the chamber received no natural light. Henry sat down across from him and said nothing. He waited. Dexter knew what that meant. He opened the first ledger. The wage structure for Omega servants in Blackthorn Citadel had been set at 1 silver coin per month for basic kitchen and domestic labor. That standard had been in place for 20 years. What Dexter explained to Henry, with careful precision and without meeting his eyes for more than a second at a time, was that 3 years ago, the Elder Council had introduced a containment compliance assessment. It was described in administrative language as a fee applied to Omega servants for the cost of maintaining the enforcement apparatus of the Rite of Containment. The fee was deducted directly from wages before payment. It amounted to 1/4 of a silver coin per month. Henry let Dexter finish. Then he said, "They are paying for the cost of their own punishment." "Effectively, yes," Dexter said. He turned 3 pages in the ledger. "The second issue is the apothecary." The Citadel Apothecary had been privatized through a council resolution 4 years ago. The license to operate the apothecary, which was the only source of officially sanctioned heat suppressants within the Citadel, was held by a trading company called the Garside Merchant Collective. Dexter said the name quietly, and then watched the king's face. Brandon Garside, Elder Council member. The man who had sat with his hands folded on his walking stick in the training yard that morning, while Eleanor Appleton's legs shook against leather straps. Heat suppressants purchased through the Garside Merchant Collective cost 4 silver coins per cycle. An Omega servant earning 1 silver coin per month, after the containment compliance assessment reduced that to 3/4 of a silver coin per month, would need more than 5 months of savings to afford a single cycle of suppressants. If she missed a cycle for any reason, including simply not having saved enough, she was legally required to report herself for containment review. If she did not report herself, and her heat began naturally in a public space, she was automatically subject to the Rite. Henry sat very still while Dexter explained this. He kept both hands flat on the table. He was not a man who threw objects when he was angry. He had learned early that rage was most effective when it was managed, compressed, and directed. But the effort of that compression was visible to anyone who knew what to look for, and Dexter Pickering had known Henry Luxford for 11 years. "The system makes it mathematically impossible for an Omega servant to maintain continuous suppressant coverage," Henry said. "Yes," Dexter said. "The gap is structural. At current wages and current prices, after the compliance fee, an Omega servant can afford suppressants roughly every 5th or 6th cycle if she saves nothing else. Food, clothing, any personal cost at all makes that interval longer." Henry pushed back from the table. He walked to the far wall and stood there, looking at the iron-banded chest at the end of the row. It was the chest that held the Dominion's emergency reserves. He had never opened it for anything less than war. He thought about Eleanor Appleton in the healer's wing, staring at a patch of lighter mortar, refusing to look at him. He thought about what she must have thought when the suppressant cost fell beyond what she could reach after the compliance fee took its share. He thought about how long she had worked in the Citadel kitchens and how many times she must have calculated and recalculated the numbers and come up short. Pull every ledger entry connected to the apothecary license and the compliance assessment for the past 4 years, he told Dexter. Have Luca Berkeley cross-reference them with Elder Council session minutes. I want to know when each decision was made, who moved it, and who seconded it. Have it on my desk by morning. Yes, my king, Dexter said, and he was already reaching for the next stack of ledgers before Henry had finished speaking. Henry left the treasury. He climbed the inner stairs to the upper corridor that connected the treasury to the council chamber. He did not go to the council chamber that evening. He went to his study and sat with the documents Dexter had already prepared and read everything twice. Then he sat with his hands on the desk and looked at nothing. The Rite had not been cruelty for cruelty's sake. That would have been simple. Cruelty for cruelty's sake could be punished and ended and explained to the pack as an aberration. This was something much harder to cut out cleanly. This was a system in which the suppression of Omega servants was profitable, and the profit circulated back to the men who wrote the laws. He had not built it, but he had signed documents that allowed it to grow, and that was going to matter to the woman in the healer's wing who refused to look at him. Chapter 4. The Private Confrontation. The council chamber of Blackthorn Citadel sat directly below the great hall, accessed through a narrow passage that forced a man to turn sideways if he was broad in the shoulders. It was not an accident of architecture. The original builders had designed it that way to discourage large armed retinues from accompanying men into private sessions. It had the secondary effect of making the room feel slightly sealed off from the world above it, which suited the elder council's purposes precisely. Henry arrived there the following morning before the council's scheduled session. He came with Liam Clifton at his back and the ledgers Dexter had compiled under his arm. Connor Rowley was already present, so was Brandon Garside. The other two older seats were empty. Connor rose when Henry entered. The courtesy was formal and correct, and contained not a trace of warmth. Henry set the ledgers on the council table. He did not sit. He stood at the head of the table the way he stood in front of military maps when he was about to explain a change of strategy to officers who would not like it. "Containment compliance assessment," he said. 3 years. Apothecary monopoly through the Garside Merchant Collective. 4 years. The duration amendment to the Rite. Last winter. I want to discuss all 3. Brandon Garside folded his hands on the table. He was a careful man who never spoke first when Connor was in the room. Connor Rowley looked at the ledgers and then at Henry. The council introduced those measures in response to legitimate pack stability concerns. Unsanctioned heat events in shared living spaces create unrest. The compliance fee funds the enforcement infrastructure that protects the broader pack. The apothecary license ensures quality control. The duration amendment reflects updated medical consensus on the Rite's efficacy. "Whose medical consensus?" Henry asked. Connor paused. "The healer review panel appointed by this council." "Not Amelie Hampton," Henry said. "The panel is composed of practitioners appointed through the standard council process." Henry opened the first ledger and turned it to face Connor. "The compliance fee is deducted before wages are paid. An Omega earning 1 silver coin per month takes home 3/4 of a silver coin after the assessment. Suppressants through the Garside Collective cost 4 silver coins per cycle. Walk me through the arithmetic, Connor. At what point is Omega able to maintain continuous coverage?" Connor's mouth tightened. "Omegas who cannot afford suppressants have access to council-sponsored deferment applications. But there is a process." "Eleanor Appleton was in the Citadel kitchens for 2 years, Henry said. "Show me her deferment application." The silence stretched. Brandon Garside's hands tightened slightly on the table edge. "The deferment application process requires a formal request submitted through the head of domestic staff," Connor said. "If the application was not submitted, that is the individual's failure to navigate available systems." Henry looked at him for a long moment. "Till she is 19 years old. She earns 1 silver coin per month. You built a system where she cannot afford the suppressants that would keep her out of the Rite, removed 1/4 of her wage to fund the Rite's enforcement, sold her the only legal suppressants at a price she cannot reach, and then punished her when biology did what biology does. And your position is that she failed to navigate available systems." Connor straightened his shoulders. "Your Majesty, I understand the emotional weight of yesterday's event. I also understand the political weight of what you are implying. 3 Northern Pack Lords have already sent their concerns regarding the Rite's suspension. House Torp, House Sweat, and House Padley command combined military forces of 4,000 soldiers. If this council loses their confidence in the Crown's commitment to traditional pack order, or those forces are not available for the spring border defense." Brandon Garside spoke for the first time. The Northern Alliances have been the cornerstone of Luxford Dominion security for 60 years. The men who built those alliances understood that pack stability requires clear hierarchies. Clarity of hierarchy requires consequence for those who disrupt order. The Omega in question disrupted order. She ran out of money, Henry said. Brandon's expression didn't flicker. She lacked the resources to comply with established law. That is the same outcome, legally speaking. Henry looked at both men. He did not raise his voice. That would have been easier for them, because loud anger was something they knew how to manage. Quiet anger was harder to counter. I will be reviewing every council amendment bundled into administrative packages over the past 5 years, he said. I expect full cooperation. If any amendment is found to have been included without full transparency of its practical effects, it will be reviewed for reversal. This is not a request. He picked up the ledgers and walked out of the chamber. Behind him, Connor Rowley sat still for a full minute after the sound of Henry's footsteps faded. Then he looked at Brandon Garside and said nothing, because they had known each other long enough that the look was sufficient. Before we move forward, let me ask you something. If you were in that chamber, would you stand with Henry or with the council? Tell me honestly in the comments, and if you believe mercy should never bow to tradition, press like and subscribe to Jasmine Love Tales so you never miss what happens next. Because what Henry does next will divide the entire pack. Now let us continue. Chapter 5. The Refusal. Eleanor was moved from the healer's wing to a small chamber in the east residential corridor on the 3rd day after the rite. At Amelie Hampton had cleared her for limited movement, but not for stair climbing or heavy labor. The chamber was modest by noble standards and extraordinary by servant standards. It had a window. The window faced east and caught morning light. Eleanor sat in the chair by that window when Henry knocked and waited for permission to enter. She said nothing for long enough that he knocked a second time. Then she said, "Come in." He entered without a guard, which she noted. He carried nothing except himself, which she also noted. He was a large man, wide-shouldered and long-limbed, with dark hair cut short for practicality and steady brown eyes shaped by years of command and controlled force. He wore no crown in ordinary hours. He wore a plain dark tunic and trousers and boots that were built for covering ground rather than for ceremony. He stopped a few feet inside the door. He did not move toward the other chair or toward her. He stayed at a distance that felt, and for the first time since she had seen him in the training yard, like something other than an alpha's casual assumption of space. "How is the pain today?" he asked. "Manageable," Eleanor said. She was looking out the window. The citadel's eastern courtyard was visible below, with the stables at the far edge and the practice targets set up along the south wall. 2 young wolves were running forms with practice swords. She watched them. "I came to offer you something," Henry said. "Your personal protection status. It is a formal designation under Crown law. It means you are recorded as being under direct royal protection, which removes you from the jurisdiction of standard enforcement actions. It cannot be overridden by council authority." Eleanor did not respond immediately. She watched the 2 young wolves switch from sword forms to grappling. One of them was better. She could tell because the other one kept reaching too far and losing balance. "Don't you want to refuse?" Henry said. He had been watching her profile. She turned to face him. Her grey eyes were direct and not warm. "Personal protection status means I am under your authority, rather than the council's. It is still someone else's authority. It keeps you safer than the current situation. For as long as you choose," Eleanor said, "you could revoke it tomorrow. You could die. You could decide it is no longer convenient. What keeps the next Omega servant safe? The one the Rite is applied to next week, while you are deciding what to do about me." Henry was quiet. The young wolf in the courtyard below overextended again and went down on one knee. His partner offered a hand up. He took it. "You signed the order that expanded the Rite," Eleanor said. Her voice had not risen. It did not need to. "I know you are saying now that you did not know the full effect of what you signed. I believe that you believe that. But you were also the king. It was your job to know, and for 5 years, while you did not know, the Rite ran on every Omega in this citadel who missed a suppressant cycle. The gap between not knowing and not looking is not always easy to see from where I am standing." Henry sat down in the other chair. Not because she had invited him to, because the conversation had reached a weight that standing through no longer seemed appropriate. "You are right," he said. Eleanor's eyes shifted slightly. She had expected defense, to explanation, the particular alpha fluency in reasons that she had heard from every male in authority since she was old enough to watch them operate. "I am not going to argue about your accounting of what happened," he said, "because your accounting is accurate. I signed it. I did not investigate what I was signing carefully enough. People were harmed because of that, and the fact that I was also deceived by the bundling process does not erase the harm." He looked at his hands. "Personal protection status is not a solution. You are correct about that too. What I should be offering is structural change, not personal exemption. I am still working out what that looks like, and I wanted to tell you that before I start making decisions that will affect you without consulting you." Eleanor was silent. The morning light through the window had moved while they talked, and now it fell across the floor between them rather than across the sill. She looked at it. "Are you consulting me?" she said. "I am a kitchen servant." "You were in the training yard," he said. "You were there when I was not paying enough attention. That puts you in a position to tell me things I need to hear, which is more valuable to me right now than most of the people I am currently surrounded by." She studied him the way she studied a new knife before deciding whether to trust it for detailed work. He let her look. He did not fill the silence or move to occupy more of it. "Decline the protection status," she said finally. "Change the law. That is the only offer worth considering." He nodded once. "Then that is what I will work on." He stood and moved to the door. At the threshold he stopped, not because he had more to say, but because something in the room had changed during those few minutes, and he was aware of it. The air between them had shifted from hostility to something that was not yet trusted, but was no longer quite its opposite either. He left without explaining that feeling to himself, because some things needed to be understood gradually rather than named all at once. Chapter 6. Pack Fracture. The full pack, Assembly of Blackthorn Citadel, was convened once per season in the Great Hall for the purpose of allowing pack members to hear royal and council announcements and to raise formal concerns through their designated house representatives. It was rarely dramatic. It was mostly administrative. At the emergency assembly that Connor Rowley called 6 days after the training yard incident was different. He had the authority to call it under the section of pack law that allowed the Elder Council to request a full assembly when, in their collective determination, the Crown had taken an action requiring pack-wide review. The specific mechanism he invoked was the measure of confidence, and a formal procedure by which the pack's assembled representatives could register a vote of no confidence in the ruling king's judgment on a specific matter. It had been used twice in Luxford history. Both times it had been directed at kings who were in the early stages of mental deterioration. It had never been used against a king who was simply making a choice the Elder Council did not like. Connor Rowley was of the opinion that this was an oversight that history would correct. The great hall filled an hour before the assembly was called. Shannon Swales, who worked in the serving line and therefore moved through the hall during assemblies without being noticed, watched nobles and House representatives arrive in clusters. She watched the way they divided when they entered. The families with Omega members in their households moved to the left side of the hall without appearing to discuss it. The families connected to the elder trading networks moved to the right, or the middle space was occupied by the houses that had not yet decided. Liam Clifton had positioned 12 guards along the interior walls, which was double the normal assembly complement. He had done this without being asked, and without explaining it to anyone. He simply knew what he knew about how assemblies with divided packs could end. Taylor Torp arrived with 6 enforcement officers positioned near the right rear of the hall. He had received no formal order to bring them. Connor Rowley had suggested, through informal channels, that their presence would be appropriate. Torp had brought them because he understood which direction his interests pointed, and he had always been practical about that. Luca Berkeley, the royal scribe, sat at his station near the dais with 3 blank rolls of recording parchment and 2 fresh quills. He had sharp eyes, and a very good memory for things said quickly and later denied. So Henry entered from the side passage to the dais rather than through the main hall doors. He came without ceremony, took his place at the high seat, and waited for the noise to settle. It did not settle quickly. The hall was buzzing in the way of a place where people had already been arguing before the formal proceeding began. Connor Rowley stood first. He was a precise speaker, trained in the formal rhetorical tradition of elder councils, and he used that precision now. He outlined the measure of confidence procedure. He described the training yard event as an interruption of a lawful sacred rite without procedural justification. He described the subsequent suspension of the rite as an executive action taken without council consultation on a matter of pack law that had been council-administered for generations. He described Henry's investigation into the compliance assessment and the apothecary license as overreach into the council's legislative domain. He did all of this in measured, careful language that carried the underlying message clearly enough. The king had lost his sense of proper order. Several House representatives nodded along. Several others sat very still. Henry let Connor finish. Then he stood. He described what Amelie Hampton had found in the healer's wing. He described what Dexter Pickering had laid out in the Treasury chamber. He described the mathematics of the compliance fee and the apothecary price and the wage structure. He described Eleanor Appleton's 2 years of service and her 2 years of falling short of a number that had been designed to remain just out of reach. He described it plainly, without rhetorical ornamentation, because the facts were damning enough on their own, and dressing them up would only make them easier to argue with. The left side of the hall was very quiet during this. The right side was not. Brandon Garside raised his voice from the council platform. The king is presenting a selection of facts in a sequence designed to imply conspiracy where there is administration. Every system has structural gaps. Addressing those gaps through a pack assembly based on the injury of a single servant is disproportionate and sets a precedent that would require royal review of every council decision made in the past decade. Then we will conduct that review, Henry said. A House representative from the right side stood. House Torp registers its formal support for the measure of confidence. The suspension of the right of containment is an attack on the structural integrity of pack hierarchy. A House representative from the left side stood immediately. House Clifton registers its opposition. The right as currently practiced is not what was originally sanctioned. We have seen the evidence. The amendment was not transparent. 3 more houses spoke in sequence, alternating sides. But the middle remained seated and said nothing. The middle's silence was the most important thing happening in the room, and everyone who understood power dynamics could feel it. Henry called the vote on the measure of confidence. The result was 41 in favor of expressing no confidence, 53 opposed, and 22 abstaining. The measure failed. But 41 was not a small number, as St. Henry was precise enough in his understanding of politics to know that Connor Rowley had not expected to win this vote. He had expected to count the 41, identify which houses they came from, and use that information to determine what he would do next. Henry declared the Rite formally suspended, pending full review, and dismissed the assembly. He watched the hall empty and noted which groups left together and which left separately. Luca Berkeley was still writing. Liam Clifton was watching Torp's enforcement officers leave through the rear passage. The pack had fractured. It had not broken, but the line running through it was now visible in a way it had not been the week before, and lines had a way of becoming permanent if nothing was done about the ground they ran through. Henry walked from the great hall to the upper corridor, with Liam Clifton 2 steps behind him. Liam was silent, which was how he processed information that he had not yet finished organizing into an opinion. Henry appreciated this quality. Most of the men who surrounded him had opinions before they had information, which made them useful for enthusiasm and useless for counsel. When they reached the private corridor outside Henry's study, Liam spoke. Taylor Torp is going to be a problem. He organized those enforcement officers and positioned them without anyone's orders except Connor Rowley's informal suggestion. He is testing where his authority comes from. I know, Henry said. If Torp decides his authority comes from the Elder Council, you have an enforcement apparatus that is not under Crown command, Liam said. He was not alarmed when he said it. He was precise. It was his most useful quality. Have someone watch the enforcement patrol records for the next 2 weeks, Henry said. If there are unusual orders, I want to know before they are carried out. He paused at the door to his study. And tell the Omega servants in the lower quarters, through Shannon Swales or whoever is best positioned to carry the message, that the Rite suspension applies to all enforcement actions, not just formal Rite proceedings. Or if anyone attempts to apply the Rite under informal or emergency justification, they are to report it to you directly. Yes, Liam said. He turned to go. Liam. Henry looked at his captain directly. Thank you for the extra guards at the assembly. I did not ask for them. Liam's expression did not change. I know who I serve, he said, and went. Chapter 7. The Structural Gamble. Henry spent 2 full days in his study before he made his next move. He read documents. He met with Dexter Pickering and Luca Berkeley and Amelie Hampton separately, and then together, and compared what each of them knew against what the others had found. He did not sleep well during those 2 days. He ate at his desk. Liam Clifton came in periodically and put food near him and took the empty plates away without commenting on how little was eaten. On the morning of the 3rd day, he sent for Shannon Swales. She arrived expecting to be questioned about what she had witnessed in the training yard. Instead, Henry asked her to sit down, which was itself unusual enough that she sat very carefully, as if the chair might be a different object than it appeared. He asked her to describe the Omega servants' understanding of the deferment application process. She described it honestly. Most of them had heard of it. None of them had ever successfully used it, or 3 had tried and been told their applications were incomplete, and the head of domestic staff had quietly advised the rest not to bother because the rejection rate made it not worth the time. He asked her how many Omega servants were currently in arrears on suppressant cycles. She did not know the exact number. She estimated 12, based on who she knew had been quietly managing heat symptoms with herbal remedies purchased from outside the licensed apothecary, which was itself a lesser violation of containment law. Henry thanked her and let her go. Then he sent for Luca Berkeley and spent an hour dictating. The decree he issued the following morning was a significant piece of governance. Luca read it aloud in the council chamber to Connor Rowley and Brandon Garside, and the other 2 Elder Council members, who had been given no advance notice of its contents. No, the decree dissolved the Elder Council's sole legislative authority over Omega containment law. It did not eliminate the Council. It removed their unilateral power over one specific domain and transferred that power to a newly created body called the Protection Covenant, composed of 1 appointed noble representative, 1 appointed domestic staff representative, 1 appointed healer, and 2 elected Omega representatives, chosen by vote among the Omega servants of the Citadel. The Protection Covenant had equal authority to the Elder Council on matters of Omega law, and neither body could amend Omega law without the agreement of the other. The decree also named Eleanor Appleton as provisional advisor to the Protection Covenant for a period of 90 days, while the formal election process was organized. Connor Rowley set the parchment on the council table very carefully after Luca finished reading. He set it the way a man sets down something he is working not to crumple. This decree names a servant as an advisor with access to legislative proceedings, Connor said. It names her as provisional advisor to the Protection Covenant, Henry said. The Covenant is not a legislative body. It is an oversight and reform body. Her access is to that process. The effect is identical, Connor said. An Omega servant, injured 3 weeks ago under lawful application of a sacred rite, now sits in a position of structural influence over the laws that govern her own kind. You have created a mechanism for subjects to directly influence the laws that manage them. Do you understand where that logic leads? To better laws, Henry said. Connor stood. He was 61 years old, and he had served 3 Luxford kings, and he had never raised his voice in a council chamber, not once, in 30 years. He raised it now. This is weakness dressed as philosophy. Or Omegas do not manage pack order. They are part of the pack order. The distinction is not cruelty. It is structured. Without structure, you do not have mercy. You have chaos. Henry looked at him without expression. If strength requires blindness, he said, I reject it. Connor left the chamber. Brandon Garside followed him. The 2 remaining older members stayed in their seats and looked at the wall. Henry turned to Luca Berkeley. Have copies distributed to every House representative by the end of day. Post it on the public notice board in the lower quarter. I want it read aloud in the market by the town herald tomorrow morning. Yes, my king, Luca said, and began rolling the parchment carefully. Word reached Eleanor in her chamber an hour before the public posting. Shannon Swales brought it to her directly, arriving breathless from 3 flights of stairs. As Eleanor listened to Shannon describe the decree, and then read the copy Shannon had somehow obtained, and sat with it in her lap for a long time after Shannon left. Provisional advisor. It was not a powerful title. It was not a permanent position. It could be revoked. It could be ignored. It was, by any formal measure, a small thing. But it was also the first time in Eleanor Appleton's 19 years that her name had appeared in a royal document in a capacity other than servant, and she pressed her palm flat against the parchment and held it there until she was certain her hands were steady. Chapter 8. Earned Intimacy. The private courtyard on the south side of the Citadel's residential wing was used in summer for the king's morning routine and largely abandoned in the colder months. It was a walled space about 30 feet across, stone-floored, what with a bench along the south wall and an iron frame in the corner that had held a climbing plant at some point in the past, but held nothing now except the plant's dried remains. A wooden door in the east wall opened onto it from the residential corridor. There was no other entrance, but Eleanor had found the courtyard on her second day in the residential chamber, and had been using it in the early mornings, because it was the only outdoor space she could reach without encountering the main yard traffic. She went there to walk. Amélie had told her that slow walking would help the hip muscle heal. Eleanor walked laps of the courtyard, until the cold worked through her cloak and then went back inside. Henry had not known she used the courtyard, or he found out when he came there himself one morning, 2 weeks after the council decree, and found her already there. She was near the south wall, her dark red hair loose for once, no tie, moving slowly through her 4th or 5th lap. She heard him at the door and stopped. He held up his hand in something that was not a wave and not a formal gesture, more a reflex indicating he had not come looking for her. "I did not know you used this space. I can go." "It is your courtyard," she said. "It is an unused courtyard," he said. "There is a difference." He came in and sat on the bench without approaching her. She resumed walking after a moment. He watched the dry plant skeleton in the iron frame move in a draught that came through a gap in the south wall's stonework. They stayed in that arrangement for a few minutes, her walking, him sitting. The courtyard was quiet except for the sound of boots on stone, and, somewhere beyond the wall, the distant rhythm of the practice yard. "You named me as an advisor without asking me," Eleanor said. She said it without accusation. She said it as a fact. She was placing it on the table between them. "I did," Henry said. "I should have asked first. I made another decision about your position without consulting you. That is a habit I need to break, and this is a fair time to say so." Eleanor stopped walking. She turned toward him and studied him from across the courtyard, the way she had studied him in the small chamber. The light was better here. She could see his face more clearly, and what she saw was a man who was tired in the way of someone who had not been sleeping well and was not pretending otherwise. "You are used to deciding," she said. "It is not always a bad quality. It depends what you decide." "I decided well on some things," he said, "and I decided poorly for a long time about others. Those do not cancel each other out." She crossed the courtyard and sat on the other end of the bench. Not close. 2 feet of distance, which was nonetheless substantially closer than she had placed herself in their previous conversations. She tucked her hands under her cloak and looked at the iron frame. "The protection covenant is real," she said, "not a gesture." "It is real," he said. "Connor will try to undermine it through adjacent legislation. I expect that, and I am prepared to counter it. The covenant has explicit authority in the decree, and the decree is public record, which makes it harder to simply ignore." "What happens if he builds enough opposition to force your abdication?" she asked. She asked it the way a person asks about a real risk that they have been calculating privately and finally decided to name. "Then whoever comes after me will inherit the covenant in law and will have to publicly dismantle it to remove it," he said. Which they could do, but they would have to do it where everyone could see. Eleanor looked at her hands where they were folded under the cloak. "You planned for that." "I am not reckless about this," he said. "I am angry and I want things changed, but I know how power moves, and I have tried to structure what I have done so that it is harder to reverse than it was to build." He paused. "I also know that my anger does not give me the right to move faster than the situation can absorb. You told me something in your chamber about the difference between not knowing and not looking. I have been thinking about it since." The morning air was cold and still. Eleanor could see her breath. She could see him too. "My mother was Omega," she said. "She worked in a mill town south of the Garside territory. She died when I was 14. I came to the Citadel to work because it had walls, and I thought walls meant safety." She said it without self-pity, or just information being transferred from one person to another. "I thought if I saved enough and kept invisible enough, I would eventually reach the border towns where the laws are different. I was a week short of the suppressant cost when they docked the compliance fee the first time. After that, I was always behind." Henry was silent. He did not fill the silence with reassurance or explanation. He simply held it with her. "I am sorry," he said finally. 2 words, who said the way he had said them in the healer's wing, with no attempt to soften them into something more comfortable. She turned and looked at him. They were close enough on the bench that she could see the particular tiredness around his eyes, the lines around his mouth that she had assumed were severe, but were now, up close, something more complicated. He was looking back at her with the same directness she had shown him across every conversation they had had, and she recognized it because she had been doing it herself for 19 years, looking at people and assessing exactly what they were rather than what they were presenting. She moved her hand out from under the cloak and placed it on the stone of the bench between them, not reaching for him, just placing it there in the open. He looked at her hand. Then he reached across the 2 feet of the cold stone bench and covered it with his own. His hand was large and warm, and he held her hand with careful steadiness, the way he held everything, with a control that she was beginning to understand was not coldness, but its opposite. A man who was careful precisely because the feelings were strong, and he did not want the strength of them to be a weight on someone who was already carrying enough. She turned her hand over under his and let her fingers curl slightly. They sat like that for a few minutes in the cold morning air, not speaking, nor watching the dry plant move in the draught from the south wall. When she stood to go back inside, he stood also. At the door she stopped and looked back at him over her shoulder, just briefly. "I want the covenant to succeed," she said, "not because you built it, because it is the right structure." "I know," he said. "But also," she said, and there was something in her voice that had not been there before, like something that was not warm exactly, but was no longer the controlled absence of warmth either. "I am glad it was you who stepped forward in the training yard." She went inside. Henry stood in the cold courtyard for a long moment after the door closed, his hand still slightly open at his side, feeling the absence of warmth where her fingers had been. He had not expected the conversation to go the way it went. He had come to the courtyard without planning to see her, and had found her already there, and somehow ended up sitting on a bench in the cold, saying things he had not yet said to anyone else, including Liam Clifton and Amelie Hampton, who were the 2 people in Blackthorn most likely to hear him honestly. He could not explain the difference. He had spent some time in the previous 2 weeks trying to explain it to himself, and the explanation kept coming back to the same simple fact. Eleanor Appleton did not want anything from him except what she had already stated plainly. She wanted structural change. She had been absolutely specific about it, and completely uninterested in softer offerings. That precision was clarifying in a way that most of his conversations were not. He knew the difference in their ages and positions. He knew what men in power often did with that difference. He had decided long ago he would not be that kind of king. Eleanor Appleton had said no to him multiple times since they met. She had declined the protection status. She had declined comfortable reassurances. She had challenged the declaration framing before it was even fully formed. She had turned her face away from him in the healer's wing with a directness that had made 3 of his senior commanders uncomfortable on his behalf. She was not a woman who lacked the means to refuse him. He let that register, and then he went to find Liam Clifton. There was a public declaration ceremony to plan. Chapter 9. The Shock. The public declaration ceremony was held in the Great Hall of Blackthorn Citadel on a morning 43 days after Eleanor Appleton sobbed 2 sentences across a stone yard and changed the direction of a kingdom. The Great Hall was full. This is the moment everything changes. If you have stayed this far into the story, you are part of this pack now. Take a second and subscribe to Jasmine Love Tales if you have not already. Press like if you believe power should protect, not punish. And tell me in the comments, do you think the pack will accept what Henry is about to do? Because once this declaration is spoken, there will be no turning back. Now let us enter the Great Hall. Liam Clifton had spent the previous 3 days ensuring it would be full, and sending formal notices to every House representative, every senior pack member, every merchant and craftsperson standing in the Citadel community. He had also quietly ensured that every Omega servant in the Citadel who wished to be present was allowed to position themselves in the upper gallery, which had historically been reserved for noble observers, and which was now filled with women in kitchen linens and domestic dress standing shoulder to shoulder, looking down. Shannon Swales was among them. She stood in the front row of the gallery and gripped the railing and watched the floor below with the expression of someone who has spent a long time not daring to want something, and is now in the moment of discovering whether the wanting was worth it. Connor Rowley was present. He had come because absence would have been interpreted as concession, and he was not prepared to concede. He sat on the elder platform with Brandon Garside and the other 2 elder members, his face carefully composed, his hands folded on his walking stick. Taylor Torp stood near the back of the right side of the hall with 2 of his enforcement officers. He was present as a procedural observer, since enforcement had no formal role in a declaration ceremony. He was also present because Connor Rowley had made certain he knew the ceremony was happening. Luca Berkeley sat at his scribing station with 4 rolls of fresh parchment. It was because he expected this to be a long recording session, and he had learned in 43 days to prepare for everything Henry Luxford might decide to do. Eleanor arrived through the side passage rather than the main doors. She was dressed in a dark blue wool dress that Emily Hampton had located through the domestic stores, plain and well-made, belted at the waist. She wore her hair tied back. She walked without the cautious economy of a woman protecting a healing injury. She walked with the careful deliberateness of a woman who has decided that today she will not be invisible. She took a position to the right of the dais, standing rather than seated. Liam Clifton positioned 2 guards nearby, not to constrain her, but as a signal to anyone who might consider making her mourning difficult. Henry entered through the main passage and mounted the dais. He wore his crown today. He wore the formal cloak bearing the Luxford wolf sigil. He was every inch the Alpha King who had held the Northern Territory for a decade, and he stood at the high seat without sitting and waited for the hall to go quiet. It went quiet faster than it usually did. The hall understood that something definitive was about to happen. He spoke for a long time. He did not use rhetorical flourish. He described what had happened in the training yard 43 days ago. He described what Emily Hampton had found in the healer's wing. He described the mathematics of the compliance assessment and the apothecary monopoly. He described the Elder Council's amendment bundled into an administrative package under his signature. He described the Pack Assembly's no-confidence vote and its failure. He described the Protection Covenant decree. He described all of it in sequence, plainly, as a public accounting of events he was responsible for clarifying for his pack. The hall was very still. Then he reached the formal decree portion of the ceremony. Luca Berkeley rose and read the first document aloud. The right of containment was formally and permanently abolished, not suspended, not under review, abolished. The text was unambiguous. The right could not be reinstated by council decree, elder vote, or administrative action. Reinstatement would require a full legislative assembly before the gathered houses and the royal seal placed in an open hall. Connor Rowley's hands tightened on his walking stick. In the upper gallery, Shannon Swales pressed her lips together and breathed through her nose. Luca read the second document. The Omega Containment Compliance Assessment was dissolved effective immediately. All wages currently subject to the deduction would receive back pay calculated from the date the assessment was introduced. Dexter Pickering had already calculated the figures. The Treasury would fund it. The third document. The apothecary monopoly held by the Garside Merchant Collective was revoked. The apothecary license was transferred to the Citadel's Public Health Administration under Amelie Hampton's oversight. Heat suppressant pricing would be set at 1/2 silver coin per cycle, funded through a levy on noble households with more than 50 acres of pack territory. Brandon Garside stood at the reading of this one. He did not say anything. He stood as a formal protest gesture at the elder tradition of standing in dissent. Henry acknowledged it with a look and returned his attention to the hall. The fourth document was the one no one had expected. Luca read it with the careful precision of a man who understood he was scribing history and intended to do it well. The document formalized the Protection Covenant as a permanent governance structure with equal authority to the Elder Council on all matters of Omega law and welfare. It established a process for expanding the Covenant's mandate over time pending review. It set the first formal election for Omega representatives within 30 days. And then it named Eleanor Appleton, age 19, formerly of the Citadel Kitchen domestic staff, as the permanent founding member and chair of the Protection Covenant, with a term of 3 years renewable by vote. The upper gallery produced a sound that was not quite a cheer and not quite a sob. It was something in between. Shannon Swales's knuckles were white on the railing. The lower hall produced a different sound. On the left side, a rising murmur that moved toward something close to relief. On the right side, a sharper noise that was several things at once, shock and indignation and the particular sound of men recalculating. Connor Rowley was on his feet. You have named a servant to a permanent position of governance authority. This is constitutionally unprecedented. The pack law does not permit. The pack law permits the king to create new governance structures by royal decree, Henry said. That is what I have done. The Protection Covenant is a new structure. Its composition is established by decree. Eleanor Appleton's appointment is lawful and permanent. He looked at Connor with an expression that had no anger in it, which was more unnerving than anger would have been. If you wish to challenge the decree through proper channels, the process is available to you. If you wish to challenge it through other means, I am prepared for that also. Connor looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked around the hall. He was counting, the way he had counted at the no-confidence vote. He did not like the count he was arriving at. He sat down. Henry stepped down from the dais. The hall watched him cross the floor to where Eleanor stood. He stopped in front of her, and the hall went perfectly silent, the kind of silence that happens when several hundred people simultaneously stop breathing. Henry Luxford, Alpha King of the Luxford Dominion, 32 years old, who had held the Northern Territory for a decade and had never knelt in this hall for anything other than his coronation oath, went down on one knee. Not in the posture of a man proposing ownership. Not with his head bowed in submission. He knelt on one knee with his back straight and his eyes level with hers, of the posture of a king making an oath to an equal. The Protection Covenant cannot function as a gesture, he said, loud enough for the hall. It requires someone who knows what it is to stand inside the system and see its mechanisms from the inside. It requires someone who has not been trained to mistake comfort for justice. He looked at Eleanor directly. I am asking you to chair it, not because you were harmed, not because it corrects a wrong done to you personally, but because you are the clearest thinker in this citadel, and the pack needs what you see. Stand beside me, he said. Rule with me. The hall made a sound that it would take Luca Berkeley 3 different drafts to adequately describe in the official record. He eventually settled on. The assembly registered a significant and divided response. Eleanor looked down at him. Her grey eyes moved across his face with the same assessing precision she had used on him since the training yard, of reading what was real and what was performance, and whether the two aligned. She had watched him for 43 days. She had seen him buried in documents with no audience to impress. She had seen him argue treasury numbers until they made sense. She had seen him correct a soldier's footing without ceremony. She had seen the man when no one was looking. She had watched him be a person for 43 days, in addition to being a king. Or she had found that the person and the king were not in conflict with each other, which was the rarest thing she had found in her 19 years. She reached out and put her hand on his shoulder. Not gently, solidly, the way you put your hand on the shoulder of someone who has committed to a direction, and you want them to know you see it. "Stand up," she said. He stood. They were the same height when he was standing. She had not realized that before. She had always seen him from the perspective of someone who had spent 2 years making herself small, and from that perspective all authority appeared taller than it was. Standing here, in this hall, in this blue dress, this morning, she was exactly as tall as the Alpha King of the Luxford Dominion. "I will chair the covenant," she said, loudly enough for the hall, "on the condition that its decisions are binding and not advisory. I will not run a body that produces recommendations for the king to consider. I will run a body that makes law." The right side of the hall produced a sharp intake of collective breath. Henry looked at her for one beat. Then he turned to the hall. "The Covenant's decisions on Omega law are binding, subject to the same royal review process as Elder Council law. That was always the intent. I will have Luca amend the decree language before day's end to make it explicit." "Then yes," Eleanor said. "I accept." She turned to face the hall. 238 people looked back at her. Some of them were angry, some with calculation. Many, particularly from the upper gallery, with the expressions of people who had needed a long time to believe that this morning was real and were now making themselves believe it. Shannon Swales had both hands over her mouth. Her eyes were very bright. Connor Rowley looked at the floor. De Taylor Torp stood near the back of the hall with his 2 enforcement officers and said nothing, because the thing he had expected to prevent had already happened, and there was no longer a practical action available to him. Brandon Garside, who had sat back down when Connor sat down, looked at the dais where Henry and Eleanor now stood side by side, and he looked for a long time with the expression of a man reviewing a lifetime of assumptions and finding several of them in need of adjustment. Luca Berkeley's quill moved steadily across the parchment. He was going to need a 5th roll before this was done. Henry addressed the hall one final time. His voice was even and direct, the voice of a king who has made a decision and is not seeking affirmation for it, but is also not ignoring that the decision will have consequences he will be managing for years to come. This citadel will not look the same in a year as it does today, or neither will the Dominion's relationship with Omega Pack members. There will be members of this hall who resist that change and members who support it, and both groups will be vocal, and both groups will have arguments I will be required to take seriously. That is the nature of governance." He paused. "What I will not do, under any pressure or political circumstance, is pretend that the Rite didn't happen, or that the system that produced it was accidental, or that it is acceptable to allow it to be rebuilt under different language. The Protection Covenant exists because the consequences of the alternative were visible in the training yard 43 days ago, and I intend this pack to remember what it saw." He stepped back from the front of the dais. Eleanor remained where she was for another moment, facing the hall, now feeling the weight of 238 pairs of eyes on a woman who had come to this citadel to save enough money to reach the border towns, and had instead ended up on a dais. She thought about her mother in the mill town south of Garside territory. She thought about Shannon Swales, who had grabbed her arm and whispered to her still in the kitchen in the morning. Everything changed. She thought about the 12 other Omega servants, who were currently managing heat cycles with outside herbals because the licensed suppressant was mathematically unreachable, and about the first covenant session she was going to convene, and about the deferment application process she was going to personally dismantle and rebuild from scratch with language that a 19-year-old with 1 silver coin per month could actually navigate. She had a great deal of work ahead of her. She stepped down from the dais beside Henry. He did not take her arm or guide her. He simply walked beside her at the same pace, which was what she had asked for, without putting it in words, and which he had understood. They walked out of the great hall side by side. Behind them, the hall erupted in the competing sounds of a pack reckoning with the first day of a structure it had never had before. Some of those sounds were angry. Some were relieved. All of them were real. And real was where change actually lived, not in ceremony, but in the complicated noise that followed it. In the upper gallery, Shannon Swales finally let go of the railing. She pressed the back of her hand against her eyes, once, quickly. Then she straightened her back and turned to the woman beside her, who was also a kitchen servant, and had also come to the gallery that morning, expecting mostly to witness, and had instead received something she didn't quite have language for yet. And the woman beside her was Amy Torp, 23 years old, no relation to the enforcer, despite the shared surname, who had worked the bread ovens in the Citadel kitchen for 4 years, and who had a younger sister in the lower town who was Omega, and who Shannon knew had been quietly managing a heat cycle without sanctioned suppressants for the past 6 weeks. Amy had been standing in the gallery with her arms folded tight across her chest for the entire ceremony, and getting tighter with each document Luca Berkeley read aloud, until by the 4th document she was holding herself together, with both arms the way a person holds a thing that might otherwise come apart, when Henry knelt and said, "Stand beside me, rule with me." Amy Torp's arms had dropped to her sides. She had stood with her hands open and her face very still, and Shannon had watched her do it and understood exactly what that stillness was. It was the stillness of someone revising a future they had already resigned themselves to. "Come on," Shannon said. "We have to get back before the bread burns." And they went. 2 women in domestic dress walking through the gallery corridor of Blackthorn Citadel on a morning that would be recorded by Luca Berkeley in 5 parchment rolls and argued about by noble houses for the next generation and remembered by every Omega servant who had stood in that upper gallery with white knuckles for the rest of their lives. Below, in the private south courtyard where the dry plant still moved in the draught from the cracked south wall, nothing had changed physically. At the stone was the same stone. The iron frame was the same frame. The bench was the bench where a king and a former servant had sat 2 feet apart on a cold morning, and one of them had placed her hand on the stone between them. But the dominion that surrounded that courtyard was different now. Not completely, not without struggle still ahead, but structurally, fundamentally, in the way that decent things are built, through the slow and expensive and contentious business of making what is right into something that persists after the ceremony is over. Eleanor Appleton had walked into Blackthorn Citadel 2 years ago to survive. She had survived something the system designed to stop her. She had spoken when speaking required more courage than she was sure she had, and she had refused comfort when comfort was offered as a substitute for justice. And she had sat in a cold courtyard with her hand on a bench and decided, slowly and on her own terms, that a man could be worth the trust she did not give easily. She was still 19 years old. She had a great deal yet to do. Henry Luxford was 32 years old and had been Alpha King for a decade and had spent the last 43 days learning what his authority actually cost and what it was actually for. He had made decisions he could not undo, and signed papers he should have read, and allowed systems to grow that he was now dismantling at significant political cost. He was also the man who had crossed a stone yard in 8 steps and said to release her, and who had gone down on one knee in a full assembly not to offer ownership, but to offer partnership. The pack had been shocked, not by violence, not by the usual language of power, by mercy enforced as law, which was, as it turned out, for the most shocking thing of all. The Luxford Dominion did not transform in a single morning. The documents Luca Berkeley wrote on 5 rolls of parchment were real and binding. But real and binding documents still required real and persistent people to enforce them in the days and weeks and years that followed. Connor Rowley spent 3 months challenging the Protection Covenant's authority through every procedural channel available to him. He lost 2 of those challenges and won 1 minor revision to the Covenant's amendment process that granted the Elder Council a required review interval before Omega law changes could be enacted. It was the one concession Henry judged worth granting, because it gave Connor something to point to without actually reducing the Covenant's binding power. Taylor Torp resigned his enforcement position 6 weeks after the declaration ceremony and took a position with House Suite in the Northern Territory. Liam Clifton appointed his replacement from within the Crown Guard, a younger officer named Oscar Colby, who had been in the training yard on the morning of the Rite, and who had been one of the guards who shifted his weight and stared at the ground. Oscar Colby, it turned out, had been staring at the ground because he was ashamed, was not because he was indifferent, and shame in the right direction was something Liam Clifton considered useful in a young enforcer. The Protection Covenant held its first formal session 11 days after the declaration. Eleanor chaired it from a seat at the center of the table rather than at the head, which surprised the appointed noble representative, but which Eleanor explained simply as a preference for everyone being able to see everyone else without having to turn their heads. She opened the session with the deferment application process, and they did not leave the room until they had replaced it with something that a 19-year-old with 3/4 of a silver coin per month could actually use. Shannon Swales attended the second session as the elected domestic staff representative, having been nominated by every Omega servant in the Citadel kitchen and the residential staff combined. She arrived at the session with a list of 17 specific items she wanted addressed, organized by priority, with notes on each one. Eleanor looked at the list and then looked at Shannon and said she would make an excellent permanent representative. Shannon said she intended to be. If this story moved you, do not leave quietly. Subscribe to Jasmine Love Tales for more powerful werewolf romances where strength meets justice and love reshapes kingdoms. Press like if Eleanor's courage earned your respect. And tell me in the comments, if you had been standing in that training yard, would you have looked away or stepped forward? Your voice matters here. Until the next tale.